Welcome back to the Beyond the Bucket show. I am excited to have my uncle, Kurt Robinson, join the program. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It's going to be fun too. Very proud of what you're doing. Very proud of the career you made for yourself and establishing your podcast. And it's a very good podcast. I've been watching it.
Well, thank you. And I'm excited for everybody to kind of get to know you. You are a serial entrepreneur. You've been an entrepreneur probably since you were at a young age. And you've done so much in the sporting world. You've done so much as an attorney. You've done so much in the business world. So I'm really excited to have you on and just kind of share your insights with everybody, and they get a quick dive in on Kurt Robinson. But I want to start with a 3-minute background story on you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you come from? Things like that. I obviously know where you came from, but I want the listeners to get a better understanding of who you are.
Okay, born in Detroit, Michigan. Some of this might be news to you. Born in Detroit, Michigan, lived most of my life in St. Louis, Missouri. Went to college at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. From there, I went and worked on Capitol Hill for a year. From there, I went to law school, practiced law for about 35 years. Then 4 years ago, I started a cannabis company, which we recently sold. I've done a lot of things in between that. Owned a jazz club, represented probably about 50 NFL players, and worked as a sports agent. And now I'm in the movie business. So
definitely. Well, let's start off with that. The social injustice that is going on in the United States has obviously been going on for a number of years, for hundreds of years. And you are in the process of getting the documentary, hopefully on Netflix or another platform like that. Talk about your documentary. What is it about? And, what do you expect to hopefully enlighten people on?
Well, I started the documentary I had just sold my cannabis company, so it was time for another Act 4. So I decided, based on what was happening, I think with COVID, I think everybody really has to reevaluate what their future is going to be, because I kind of feel like the old thought process doesn't work anymore.
Sure.
So for me, I just looked at it from a factual basis, and I think you did the same thing. I actually started with a podcast. You can see my podcast studio all set up here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to be with some of my former players and a local comedian, Rudy Ortiz, who's on KBLX. But we were going to shoot it live, kind of like in the style of Breakfast Club or something like that.
Sure.
But COVID kind of made that obsolete. In fact, the day we were scheduled to shoot the first podcast was the day that we went on lockdown. So canceled that. We had shot a bunch of stuff that we had planned to air at the Super Bowl, but then the 49ers lost the game.
Yeah.
And people don't really care about losing teams. So we really didn't go with, we shot some interviews with Jerry Rice. We shot a big interview with Deebo Samuel pregame, but they lost the game. So we decided not to go forward with much of that content, because unfortunately people just don't care when you lose the game. And then all the social momentum started. And I felt like Oakland has been the center of protests really historically since the 40s. Many people don't know that A. Philip Randolph, in many ways, was the founder of the civil rights movement from the Pullman Porters that started in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Robeson was there in the 40s and 50s when Black folks migrated to Oakland.
Right.
Oakland pretty much been the center of protests throughout the country. The Black Panthers started in Oakland. Actually, the Black Lives Matter movement was an outgrowth of the Oscar Grant shooting.
Right.
So much protest has originated in Oakland that we decided to do a film on the history of protests in Oakland and expand it out to cover so many of the other things that have happened. Oscar Grant was really the first cell phone murder, pretty much. A lot of people think it was Rodney King, but Rodney King actually was filmed by somebody. Oscar Grant, who was killed at BART station in Oakland, was the first time something big was really caught on the cell phone. Right. And your generation has lived with that. We did an interview with your grandmother and my mom, and she talked about the impact of Emmett Till on her life and seeing the funeral of Emmett Till and the body of Emmett Till. And with technology, we've been able to expand that through the cell phone. In those days, it was just Ebony magazine or Jet magazine that Black folks saw things. But now through technology, everybody can see something in an instant. So in a way, the George Floyd, the Oscar Grant is the Emmett Till of this generation. So what we did is try to do a historical perspective on that, because a lot of people don't know about Emmett Till. A lot of people don't even know about Oscar Grant, although it's recent history. So we're
Sure.
trying to do a historical framework on the history of protests has developed in Oakland, but at the same time discuss the whole national protest and civil rights issue. So it's going to be fun. It's called Ready to Be Seen because we feel like people are ready to be seen now. So that's how we came up with the title.
For sure, this time has allowed me as a young Black man to even educate myself more about what happened to Emmett Till, about what happens with the systemic racism that everybody talks about. What are the intangibles that have made it this way for so long? And it opens my eyes to so many different things. I've watched a handful of documentaries that have shaped my perspective and just seeing it in a different way, because we grew up here. Me and your kids, we're kind of oblivious to some of the things that go on throughout the country, or not really oblivious. It just doesn't happen as frequent. Oscar Grant, like you mentioned, did happen in Oakland, which is close to us, but we didn't really know about that until we watched the movie, Fruitvale Station. So in a lot of ways, it's opened my mind, and then it gets me to thinking, as I was, just visiting with Grandma this weekend, as we talked about before we jumped on, what can I do now, being, in my late 30s, getting ready to transfer over to that next generation? How can I make it better for some of these younger, individuals that will be going through this, for their entire life, right? So, that's a question that I have to you, because it's been something on my heart for so long now.
Well, for me, I was lucky and I have girls. So, I don't think the risk of a Black woman being shot as is high, although we can see with Breonna Taylor that it can happen.
Sure.
I think when you have a young Black son like you do, you're going to have to deal with some of those issues. I think actually Laura, my daughter Laura, was a little different from you because Laura was actually in the hood in Oakland with me and probably saw a lot more than you saw. I mean, the night before she went to college, I had to go and collect money from some really unscrupulous people that owed me money for practicing law. So the night before she left, we were in the hood in Oakland collecting money from dope dealers. So I think she was exposed to a lot of things uh, that you may have not been, because she had to go with me to collect money and do stuff like that in the straight hood. So I think she saw some of it. Nicole really didn't see that. But I think in a situation like you have, I think the most important thing you can really even do with your podcast, in this space and the time that I practiced law, and it's been like 3 years really since I practiced law, but the most important thing I would say to your listeners, um, right now, everybody's kind of militant. People don't understand. It's great to be militant. It's great to be seeking power. But when you're in the streets and you're stopped by the police, that is not the time to make your powerful statement. And I think that a lot of young people now feel like they're not having it no more, and they're not going to take it, and they're ready to confront police in the street. That is always a mistake. For a young Black man to be confrontational with police in any situation is always a mistake. Now, you can call it being an Uncle Tom or whatever you want. I call it trying to live to fight another day.
Right.
Because you saw there are really two systems of justice in this country. One for a guy like Rittenhouse, who walks around carrying a rifle and walks past the police and they give him a bottle of water and let him go home. That's not going to happen to you.
Right.
Walk down the street with a rifle and see how quickly you're shot from long range. So I think the great thing about the situation in Kenosha is it illustrates what I've seen for many years, is that there are two systems of justice in this country. And people really don't realize that. I think actions in Kenosha illustrate that for the world, where you see a man shot 7 times in the back. There were so many alternatives. They could have hit him in the head with a billy club.
Right.
They said they tased him. They could have tackled him. There were so many other options to shoot them 7 times in the back. And you see Rittenhouse just walk straight through, armed with a rifle, having murdered somebody, and this kid goes home to his house in Illinois.
Yeah.
So that tells you, the difference in the justice systems in America, and it's a stark reality that we must fight through the courts and we must fight through protests, but you cannot fight that in the street with an individual police officer.
Sure.
But, I mean, I really do feel like if you understand that, that's the most crucial thing that people need to understand, because these killings have gone on forever. It's just that they catch them on cell phone now, and
Right.
they're going to continue, which is the thing. I mean, the NBA is not going to be able to stop playing every time a black man is murdered, because that's not going to stop, not immediately. Hopefully, through training and protests and legislation, it can change. But in the interim period, we have to accept the fact we can't mess with the police in the street. So when the police stop you, you just gotta comply. As tough as that is to hear, and as tough as that is in situations when the police are being unfair, it's a life-saving technique. So I think it's important, especially for young people, because I see a lot of these young people who are like, hey man, I ain't taking this from the police. When you're in the street, you have to take it from the police, because the police will win.
Right.
That is not a situation where you can win. You can win in courts, you can win with a lawsuit. A lot of people have collected millions of dollars for policemen and millions of dollars in police brutality cases. That's the way to fight it, not to try to resist it in the street, because you end up George Floyd. That's just the way it is. It's a fact of life. So if I was going to leave your listeners with anything today, from even white kids, black kids, don't fool with the police now. You see the protesters who stand in the police face and yelling at them. Okay, on a protest, you can get away with that. In the street, it gets you killed. So I think that's really the most important thing. So what I'm really saying is the most important thing is for you to educate the kids you coach, and
Mhm.
educate your own kids that let's stop the death first, okay? And the way to stop the death is to accept that we live in a world where we have two systems of justice.
Right.
We're on the wrong side of one of them, and until that changes, we have to just comply to stay alive. But
Right.
we have to continue to protest and fight, but not in an individual situation with cops.
And you're uniquely positioned to talk about that because your time as a lawyer, you've seen that over and over being the case where the police are so insulated as far as the structure around the police departments. The rules allow them more leeway to get away with, actual crimes against civilians, even if the civilian didn't mean to. But in a lot of police forces, if they felt that they were in danger and they pull the trigger, well, they can get off because of what the actual police commissions and the rules and regulations that are so ingrained into these systems. And that's where it really needs to change. And hopefully those things do change at some point.
Well, police officers have qualified immunity. You've heard a lot about that.
Hmm.
For the most part, municipalities have immunities to lawsuits, which have to be overcome to follow them.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that legislation can change. That's one of the things that protests can change. I know that the NBA players are taking a big stand to invest money in changing the law with respect to qualified immunity. So I don't think you have to really. I think one of the things you learn being in law is, for the most part, there's two sides to every story, and what really happens is somewhere in the middle. Most times, police reports are not accurate. They're going to be written in a way to protect the officer.
Sure.
And it's hard to combat that unless you have the right tools and you know how to find those errors, and you have investigators and people to help you. So it's very difficult to follow these cases, but in recent years, people have been more and more successful.
Right.
So, I mean, I think the future in terms of limitations on qualified immunity is bright. I do suspect that in the next few years there'll be legislation to change that. But I also have to say, uh, there's a lot less civility in the world under Trump because I had many trials many years ago where I'd fight in a trial with cops and we'd go have a drink in Manny Cellar and Oakland afterwards. For the most part, that has changed. It used to be the relationships were better than they were, but in the environment of today, I actually don't see why anybody would want to be a police officer. Because I actually do have, I recently learned to shoot, and I never learned to shoot, but I had a buddy who was a police officer who insisted that I learn how to shoot for my own personal protection. And he actually bought me a gun and taught me how to shoot. So I'm not here to say that, I don't like police officers. I don't like police officers who kill people and who don't know how to do their job, but it's not true for all police officers. And I think one of the misconceptions of the Black Lives Matter movement is that we have attacked on all police officers, and that's not really true.
Right.
We only want to weed out the bad ones because, police are important in our community. When we talk
Absolutely.
about defunding the police, what we're really talking about is really a misunderstood phrase, and it's actually an unfortunate phrase because what it really means is to take activities that are in police hands out of police hands. I don't know if you remember when we first started Champs Foundation, 20, 30 years ago when you were a kid, we had a lot of those activities in conjunction with police officers. I don't know if you remember that.
I do remember, yeah, all the football camps and kids camps that they would come out. You've had, the 49ers versus the police or the fire department. I remember all those times, yeah.
Okay, but as you see, those kind of activities change. And when those activities change, you see an increase in police shooting.
Right.
And so what defund the police is more like moving those types of activities away from the police in the organizations, maybe like something like your top flight or something like that. Whereas before, the PAL and people like that worked with the community in all kinds of ways. I think that's subsided,
Right.
because we used to deliver turkeys with the cops. And one of the things that we tried to do, and this was in the 80s, is to diffuse the relationships between the police and the community. And that was very effective when we go into people's houses with star players, Joe Montana, and sit down and talk and have coffee with people delivering turkeys.
Right.
And the police would be there and people would invite them in. And I mean, it's almost unheard of, 20 years later
Right.
that people would do those kind of things. But those are the type of things that really are community policing, and I think police departments have to get back to those activities. But I also think it's a change in the individual people. There's much less civility, generally speaking, nowadays than it was 20 years ago. And
Sure.
people on different spectrums of opinion to sit down and talk and laugh. Now everything is very antagonistic. So we have to find a way maybe to get back to, I hate to say where we were 20 years ago, because you remember in those days you didn't really hear when we were doing that about a lot of police shooting, because at least in the San Jose area, the community had a good relationship with police. And actually the 49ers helped with that a lot because we intended to do that when we started our foundation, to develop good relationships between the community and police. And that worked for many years, but nobody really picked that up after we stopped doing it.
Right. You mentioned Joe Montana. You went to college with him at Notre Dame, and then you transformed into a sports agent. Talk to me about some of your sports agent memories and things like that. You represented Hall of Famer Charles Haley and many others. You were on the Latrell Sprewell General Counsel, I believe, with Johnny Cochran, and you've kind of done a lot in that field. So talk to me about being a sports agent.
Well, I knew Joe Montana from college, and he was drafted by the 49ers when I was in law school at Santa Clara. And basically, he was one of the few people I knew in California. I remember him calling and Ginger saying, "What kind of name is Joe Montana?" Because she didn't think it was a real name. But basically, I was in the right place at the right time. Joe actually just took me into the training camp, introduced me to a guy named Eric Wright, who you're familiar with,
Hmm.
and Ronnie Lott, and Keena Turner, Roger Craig, and I ended up working with all of those guys. Haley actually came along later. Freddie Solomon, rest in peace, Freddie Solomon. Dwight Clark, rest in peace, Dwight Clark. All those guys really were my contemporaries, and they really were the guys that I hung out with. Only because the only guy I knew was Joe, related to my college years, and those were the only guys he knew. So I was actually in that circle. So I really started off at a pretty high level representing guys. And then Ronnie, I think, referred me Charles. And at that time, Charles was the Defensive Player of the Year. Um, Charles got traded to Dallas. And then he introduced me to Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin, who I ended up doing work for, Leon Lett, who I ended up doing work for, all the guys with problems.
For
so
sure.
so that led to a career in being a sports agent for a while.
Yeah. Any stories that you could tell on air? I know there's a lot that we've talked about off the air, and I know
Yeah.
you wrote a book as well.
I'm gonna plug my book on the one for stories.
Yeah.
I think I was with the Cowboys in the years when they won Super Bowls. They had a lot of characters on their team. The 49ers, for the most part, I had a lot of experiences with them, but in comparison to the Dallas Cowboys, they were fundamentally choir boys.
Right.
And Dallas is a different kind of town. The Bay Area is really not a sports fanatic town. There are a
Hmm.
lot of people who don't care about sports in the Bay Area. There are a lot of people who have other interests, and the Bay Area is such a diverse community. There's so many other things to be into other than sports. Texas is very different.
Right.
Texas is live and die Dallas Cowboys. So my experience in Texas were very unique in terms of just going from a community that was open-minded with a lot of divergence to a community that lived and died Dallas Cowboys. So it was a very big difference. I was lucky in that both teams during the time I worked with them basically had dynasties. A lot of that I connect to Charles because Charles was a member of both teams. During that time, we got 5 Super Bowl rings, which at the time was the most. Brady, I think, has since beat that. But generally speaking, I mean, you deal with players. It can be a glorified babysitting job.
Right.
It's a great job to have because you can make. It's a lucrative job, but it's actually a hard job. It's very difficult to break into now. I see a lot of people doing it. I really wouldn't want to do it anymore. It's kind
Right.
of I'm over it, but I enjoyed it during the years I did it. I'm not giving you any stories. I know you want them, but you have to go to the book for that because in the book I was able to fictionalize the story, so I didn't say the players' names. But it's a lot of stories. I mean, there's so many things out now, ballers, and so many things that trail the inside story of players. Um, it looks like today's players are a little different because it seems like there's a lot more social justice initiatives from players and things like that. In those days, it was the good old North Dallas 40 party day players.
Right.
So I think today's players have basically evolved a lot from those days. So hopefully those days are over.
Everybody go check out on the one if you want some really good stories and behind the scenes info on what really happened with those, I would say golden years in the NFL and Dallas Cowboys and things like that. So really appreciate that, and hopefully everybody goes to check it out. Um, Switching topics just a little bit. You've got two beautiful daughters.
Yeah.
One was a Division I athlete, played basketball at Harvard, Laura Robinson. The other was an elite soccer player growing up and decided just to be a student. But both of them, college graduates, super successful. Laura is a big shot attorney after going to Georgetown Law. She lives in LA, and Nicole is living overseas with her husband, who is a doctor in the military. Yeah, so talk to me about being a sports father. You were and this is just my personal experience, but you were that typical father that loved sports and loved their kids and loved to be around it. You coached, you went to everything, you argued with officials, and you thought, coaches were lousy if they didn't know how to utilize your kids in the right way. So tell me about being a sports dad.
I regret a lot of things I did as a sports dad. Looking back, it's funny because when I talk to Laura about it now, she said, "Oh, you did the right thing. You should have did it more."
Mm-hmm.
I really think that I was way too hard on my daughter. But I think it takes a combination because for all the days I was too hard on my daughter, my wife, and I actually never knew. I actually found this out about 2 or 3 years ago. I'd be really hard on my daughter, and then my wife would go in there and tell her, "Hey, they don't mean this." And I actually thought she was responding just to me, but I did not know that my wife was making my message more gentle because I kind of felt like you have to have a mindset to be great. I think every champion starts as a contender that's hungry, right? So I feel like kids have to really be invested in what it is they're trying to do. A lot of kids who say, "Okay, I want to play college basketball," don't understand what goes into really doing that. I mean, it's one thing to say that, and there's one thing to be able to do it. For the most part, most people will never have a talent to play a college sport. And that's a hard thing for kids to hear, and even harder for parents to hear. And I'm sure you will deal with some of that in coaching. But
A
first,
lot.
you gotta have the talent. Secondly, if you don't have the talent, and I talked to Laura this weekend, I don't know if she agreed to this, but I told her I didn't think that she had natural talent. I think we developed her talent. Like there are some people who have natural talent, but I'll take a hard worker who will develop their talent over a natural talent in a day. Because there are a lot of players that were more naturally talented than her that weren't hard workers and weren't coachable. And those players will have a difficult time getting to a high level of a sport. I'd rather, and you're coaching, so you probably know this, I'd rather take a hard worker who's going to develop their talent and come back better every year than a super talented player that's lazy. So,
Absolutely.
so I always try to instill, like we shot 1,000 jumpers every day. So when she went to college and shot 48%, it was not because of talent. It was because of muscle memory and shooting, 1,000 jumpers every day. There are not a lot of kids who are going to be willing to do that.
Right.
They're going to be sidetracked and do other things. So I think for me, it was just a question of working with my kids. Now I had a lot of professional athletes that I was hanging with at the time that they just didn't spend enough time with their kids for them to get to that level. A lot of those kids had natural talent, but as a parent, you have to put in the time. There's no substitute for the time. I
Right.
mean, you got to throw the ball back. You gotta go to the game. You gotta do all that. And I think for us and with Nicole too, it was a big deal to play varsity as a freshman. It was just a really big deal, and both kids played varsity as a freshman because that was big to me. I felt like college scholarships are limited, and you have limited looks. So I wanted my kids to be on the varsity team as freshmen so they could get as long a look as they possibly could.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our house, that was a big deal. And both Laura and Nicole started on varsity as freshmen, which that was really the biggest thing that I pushed with them. Um, and I think that they kind of bought into that in the sports that they played. I think both of them loved the sports they played. I don't know that you can do that unless your kid buys into it. It can't be your dream. It has to be their dream. Otherwise, I don't think it ever works. I see a lot of parents who really wanted their kids to do well, but if it's not in the heart of the kid and you're pushing them in the wrong direction, it really doesn't work.
Well, I would say it's probably a fine line depending on, because Laura did want to play in college and Nicole chose not to, but it's a fine line on how much you push, and it's I think it's more of an art rather than a science. Like, I don't know, like if CJ or Maxine wants to play down the road, I kind of want to fall back and let them take the lead. But a lot, like you were saying, if you don't push them to get to where they can potentially get, they're never going to reach that because they just don't know how to get to that level. So how did you find that balance?
Well, I think again they have to buy into it, and also you have to address to your kid. Like I would say, Laura, we're going to shoot 1,000 jumpers today, and Laura would say, okay. I said, Nicole, we're going to shoot 1,000 jumpers today, and she said, why? Why? You know, all right. I read something about Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan recently, and this is a perfect example. Both great players. Michael was the kind of guy he shoot 1,000 jumpers. Kobe wanted to know why everything he did, every workout he did, he wanted to know why it helped him, what particular muscle group it worked for. So again, I think as a coach and as a parent, you got to adjust to the player you're dealing with because each player is motivated a different way. Now, Jordan wasn't any less of a player than Kobe, but he was just willing to run through a wall for it. Kobe needed you to explain it to him. So I think my kids were very much the same way. One wanted an explanation for why you wanted her to do stuff. The other one didn't. So I think you have to motivate individually,
For sure.
because each, and you coach, so each player is different. I think that I know on an NFL level and on an NBA level, star players are treated entirely differently than average players. Like when Charles was with the Cowboys, the Defensive Player of the Year, Jimmy Johnson would take things from Charles that he would cut other players for.
Sure.
And Jimmy Johnson was the kind of coach where he'd tell you that, look, you third string, you can't go to sleep in a meeting. And he cut you to make an example out of you. But Michael Irvin could stay out all night and come to practice the next day, still feeling pain. He wouldn't say nothing to him because Michael was a hard worker and he was a star. So I don't know if you can do that on a young level. I actually think it's a bad thing to do on a young level because I find that many star players have been stars their whole life and treated like stars their whole life, and it kind of ruins them in terms of making them coachable. But it's the reality of professional sports. So I think it's the same thing with kids and coaching, youth. You just have to try to adjust to your players. I see a lot of coaches who want the players to adjust to them, and I think you're less successful as a coach when you do that.
Right.
I think the good coaches adjust to the talent around them.
No
So,
doubt. No doubt. Tell me about being a lifelong entrepreneur. You have owned several businesses. You own
well,
your
I
own
just think
law practice.
I think one of the things that I learned from law is it gives you access to a lot of different careers. My original thing I wanted to go into politics, but after working on Capitol Hill and just seeing, Capitol Hill in action and Washington in action, I was very disillusioned with that. And my mom will tell you every few years I'm disillusioned with something, I need to do something new. I think the good thing about law is a vehicle for you to do a lot of things. Like you can not practice and be a politician, or you could be an agent, or it gives you a lot of access. But I was completely over law and probably did it 2 or 3 years too long. I mean, 30 years or more in any career, I think is a little tough. So actually, Joe Montana's in the cannabis industry too now.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think that he has a co-venture with Jay-Z, if I'm not mistaken. And then that business I thought was going to take off. I think it did take off, but I always look for exit strategies. So I feel like that industry was getting ready to get taken over by corporate interests, which you can see now with the big companies, Caliva, and actually Caliva is one of Joe's companies that came in and they ate up all the small companies like mine. So I was happy to sell it, and we really retained a piece of it. So it should actually take care of us in the future. But we didn't want to compete with the big boys. We basically sold out to the big boys so we could have some financial security for years to come, which is probably a better view for me. So, I just want to do things that interest me. I wanted to do a jazz club. I thought that was fun. We did that. Um, I wanted to do music videos. We did some music videos. We did rap. We actually did rap. We did for a while we did that. I don't know if you remember with Tamra and Too Short and all that. We shot rap videos for a while. So I just want to do a lot of things because I think one of the things I've learned is if you can only do one thing, you're in trouble because society will force you to adapt. And I also think that as individuals, we tire of certain things or we get less good at certain things or we lose the opportunity to do certain things. So you have to be flexible to be able to move into a different career, a different genre when you need to, or you have to, or you just want to.
Yeah, I would agree. You have to have multiple streams of income. You have to be diversified in your outlook towards life because things change and evolve, and a lot of times people can kind of get stuck in the past, and then life ends up passing them by. So, I would agree with you. I'm actually going to be doing a podcast on entrepreneurship and how you actually do it, and you're a great person to talk about it. Talk about some of the ups and downs that you've had in your career as a businessman. We talked about most of the really cool things that you've got to do, the access that you've had to professional players, the places you've been. But what are some of the pitfalls to running your own businesses and things like that?
I think the biggest pitfall, I've never really had a business where I received a check. Like you received a check from Valley Christian. I actually don't think I've ever had a real job where I received checks.
Hmm.
And I did with my cannabis company. I take that back. So I had a 3-year period there where I got paid on a monthly basis, and that was wonderful. Because I actually never did that. That didn't happen to me until I'm 60 years old. So I think that's the downfall. I think the downfall is that being an entrepreneur is a gamble. I think people don't understand that. So there's a lot more security in having a job, that you have a 9 to 5, that you have a guaranteed income. So it's a lot of downfall and always writing checks and never receiving them. So I think that would be the biggest downfall. And also, um, it's kind of feast and famine. I think my kids grew up in a feast and famine world. Either I had a bunch of money or no money. And I think that's the life of an entrepreneur sometimes.
Right.
So I think those are the biggest downfalls um, to any kind of entrepreneurial adventure. And also, some of them fail. I mean, everything I did not work. We had a jazz club that actually failed. It ran for I think 5 or 6 years, but ultimately it failed because I think music venues and clubs and things like that have kind of a shelf life to some extent. But I think what I learned from that, if I was going to say something to a young entrepreneur, I'd say you can't fall in love with your project. I think a lot of times if you have a project you fall in love with it, you want to do like you want to do a certain thing and you fall in love with that project and you're not willing to let it go. Again, I think with actually both law and also in terms of our club, I did them too long. With the club, we probably should have sold it 2 years earlier. But I was just so important to me that my idea worked and that I proved everybody was going to be successful, that I continued to do it when I could see that it was time not to do it anymore. I think
Right.
that's one of the things that's the hardest thing for an entrepreneur is to decide when to give up on an idea because everything don't work.
Hmm.
And if you're invested in it, it's very hard to look at it and say, you know what, this is not working. I got to shut this down. You
Right.
know, that I think that's the hardest thing for any entrepreneur to do. But I think it's the most important thing because I know, I ended up with a kidney transplant and being very ill. And I think a lot of that I would relate to having a jazz club because I was practicing law all day and then going to a jazz club at night to 3 or 4 in the morning. And I really couldn't do that. I really needed to make a choice. And I really didn't make a choice until I ended up with a kidney transplant because I just was doing too much.
Right.
And then the club went. So I think those are the big things. You can't sacrifice your health or you can't sacrifice your financial stability for whatever it is that your dream is.
Right.
Sometimes it works and you hear about all the dreams that work, but you don't hear much about the ones that don't. And everybody who's an entrepreneur has had failures,
Right.
And,
We both believe in education. You've been a law professor at JFK University. Talk to me about the importance of education and why, even if you're young, you want to continue your education, but even as you get older, you have to still keep your mind fresh and still learn about new things. What's the importance of education for all the listeners out there?
well, I think in terms of the pursuit of social justice, education is the most important thing because if you're ignorant of your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And a lot of young people today, they don't know our history. And if you're educated, you understand that history is a lesson. Just like in your life, everything should be a lesson. Even a failure is more of a lesson than a failure. So I feel like education is the most important thing to creating social justice because a lot of the people who are fighting in the streets are people nowadays who are pretty educated to the facts. A lot of people who are looting and tearing stuff up are people who are uneducated
Right.
because the looters are basically opportunists who are taking advantage of people with a real cause and a real message. So to me, I think that the people who are the looters are the people who are uneducated, are the people who don't see that this is a time in history that's a special time. And what makes it special is that if you look at the history of protests in America, there's never been a time where the protests were as interracial as these protests today. There
Right.
ain't that many black folks up in Portland to be fighting that way.
Hmm.
Look at it; these are very dedicated white people on my staff for my documentary. I've got a group of white people who came to me and said, "Hey, we want to do this for the movement." I'm like, "What movement?" They're like the black. I'm like, "Okay, I'd never seen this in terms
Yeah.
of the trajectory of the civil rights movement. You saw it early on in the '60s, where you had a lot of young Jewish people who were down in the South and really into it. But you haven't really seen it since then. This generation, you actually have a multinational group of people. One of the sections of our documentary, we just take pictures of Italians for Black Lives Matter. People from all over the world embracing a movement. But the reason they have embraced it is because of the success of that movement. I mean, Martin Luther King started a movement that was successful.
Yeah.
And what people don't realize is if you look back at the history of that movement, what made it more difficult was the whole era of the burn baby burn that came in around 70, where people abandoned the nonviolent protest model and went to the straight model of being adversarial, which the Panthers did. And the Panthers were great. People forgot about the breakfast programs and all the great programs they did because they basically were assassinated and wiped out because they were viewed as a threat.
Right.
Whereas the civil rights movement was ultimately a successful movement, and I think a movement has been emulated worldwide. And I think it continues to be emulated worldwide. But at the same token, you have a different group of people today who just ain't having it, and they're ready to fight a war.
Right. Just
But
tired. They're tired.
that's not the solution because the right winger, they want a war. I
Right.
mean, I really think that one of the things we've learned in our documentary is that there are forces at work here that are sinister. Uh, I knew the guy who was murdered in the federal building in Oakland. I didn't know him as a personal friend. I knew him from passing that gate that he worked at. It was an older black man, Underwood, who
Mm.
was murdered by right wing military people. I mean, the person that was arrested for that murder was active military right winger. Okay. And Trump mentioned in his speech the other day, oh, this guy, Patrick Underwood, that was murdered by extremists. Well, these were white terrorist, military, active military extremists. And one of the things that I think is that there is a push for a civil war. There really are people interested in creating that kind of situation in our country today. And actually, one of them, I believe, is Trump, because he is trying to create more violence because he thinks by scaring, the suburbs, he can get another term. And you have a lot of people who have been arrested, and we've got a lot of photos that we're using in the documentary of people who were not Black Lives Matter people who were not um, interested in this protest other than to foment violence. And these guys are right wing white supremacists.
Right.
And so it's a lot of stuff going on below the surface. That's one of the reasons we wanted to examine the protests, is people don't realize that there's a difference between protesters and looters. And again, like in the speech that Trump gave yesterday, he talked about Underwood's murder in Oakland and said how Oakland is out of control. But that was an active military person that murdered him. And there has not been a lot of publicity on that. The publicity has been around all these Antifa people and all that, but that's not who killed the federal workers in Oakland. So, I mean, that's the thing that's important for people to understand, that it's a little bit deeper than it seems on the surface. People confusing protesters and looters and right wing people. There's a lot of elements involved, a lot of foreign elements involved on both sides. It's just a lot deeper than what people think. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to do the documentary, to examine the forces that were at work in the creation of the violence during these protests too.
Right. Um, what's next for you? You've obviously done a lot in your life and in your career. What's the next stage for you looking like?
I want to make the book a movie. That'd probably be the next thing. You got to kind of have some clout to do that. I think once we get the documentary off the ground, and we've had some early interest from some relatively big companies to prove that we can make movies, I'd like to make the book a movie. Or I might want to do more documentaries. I really am enjoying this process. It's very exciting to me. Um, I, uh, I like documentary filmmaking. It's fun. And now that I'm dealing with artistic people, I'm not sure I want to deal with actors, because it's hard enough just to deal with artistic people.
Right.
I don't know if I really like. My goal was to make the book into a movie because obviously that would be profitable for me. But I think it might be my niche to do more documentary films. I fought the urge. At this point already, we've had people who want to, take over the project and make me like what would they say, a consultant. Or I mean, the problem if you're dealing with HBO or Netflix, at an early stage they want to buy your property and basically make you a consultant. But I do listen to my kid who told me to get a rough cut in the can, so that's my intent. But we did kind of get sidetracked a little with companies basically trying to kind of take the project over. And that's very tempting because there's money up front in that. But by the same token, if I were to do that, then I'd have to come up with another thing to do. So right now, I'm just set on getting this shot, and I think we'll be shooting this for another 6 or 8 weeks, and then we'll decide what we do with it. But for now, that's the imminent plan.
Awesome. Where can everybody follow you and what you're doing with the project and the book and everything?
Well, I'm not really, you really can't follow me. I'm not on, I have Instagram, I have Facebook. It's pretty much set up for me by other people. I can't even tell you what my Instagram handle is.
Hmm.
I know I have it. We have a guy who does branding for the company. The company is Melanin Works Media. Um, we have an Instagram page. I couldn't tell you what it is. Um, I basically form out all that stuff for people your age who know what they're doing. So I can't really be followed. The company is Melanin Works Media. You can probably follow the company. At this stage, Chris, I've learned that I'm not interested in being high profile. I mean, I've done some things that were high profile. Um, you mentioned the Spreewell thing, and one of the things I learned from that, uh, in that situation, I actually hired Johnny Cochran. And the reason I hired Johnny Cochran was I was actually overwhelmed by the media. I mean, I had never dealt with a national media story.
Hmm.
And I was really ill prepared to do it. I mean, and it's different from, say, you sign a contract, a big contract with a Charles Haley or with Michael or something like that. That's a whole different level from something like a Spreewell, where the media trucks are parked outside the house, and just how the media could really just overwhelm you. So I actually brought in Johnny just because I knew him, and he was coming off the O.J. Simpson case, and I was like, Johnny, this is overwhelming for me. And I got actually a lot of criticism from my friends who said, hey man, you could have got a lot more publicity if you didn't bring in Johnny. But bringing in Johnny helped me to learn how to handle that sort of thing,
Right.
because I had no idea. I actually had two situations like that. I had a juror, the first juror who was kicked off of the O.J. Simpson jury. And that was actually similar to the Spreewell situation where it was worldwide news. And like everybody in the country has your phone number and you don't know how. Good Morning America, people like that calling you. And you say, how do these people even know who I am?
Yeah.
And I really didn't particularly like that. I also found out with respect to clients I was working with that typically when your lawyer's on TV too much, it's bad for your case. Now, most lawyers don't look at it that way. Most lawyers want to be on, and you see a lot of lawyers on TV every day. I
Hmm.
always felt like that's a little selfish for the lawyer because it doesn't help the client in most of those situations when there's a lot of publicity and just overwhelming publicity. And I also saw what it did to Johnny.
Right.
Uh, I mean, Johnny would probably be alive but for the amount of publicity he had. Because after the O.J. Simpson, he just did too much, and within 5 years he was dead. So I mean, you gotta look at the situation, and to me, um, at least for a client, for the most part, you want to tamp down publicity whenever you can. I think it'd be different for a movie or something like that, but in the context that I dealt with it, and being with Joe and Ronnie, I spent a lot of time with Ronnie a lot back in the day. I think you remember that. To me, it was so intrusive into their life. I mean, even now, I think for Joe, and Joe's the kind of guy who's a quiet, kind of standoffish guy. I think you have met him, if I recall.
Hmm.
Uh, just a quiet, shy guy. And I don't think he ever enjoyed the publicity. Um, for the most part, I don't think guys enjoy it once they get it. I think everybody seeks it. But when you get it, you realize it's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, there's some people like Michael Irvin who loves it and still loves it.
Yeah.
Uh, but for everyone else,
Same with Prime.
yeah, Prime is another example. But again, Prime is two characters. We first met Prime when he was at Florida State, and he was the humblest, nicest guy that you could ever meet. But Prime was a character, and he's still the same way. In person, he's different. He is very humble and very polite. I actually saw him not that long ago, a couple of years ago, I think, or a year and a half ago. He's actually a very humble guy. And I think that he'll tell you that he created the prime persona to make money.
Right.
But as a guy, he's very different from that. Michael's different. Michael is Michael. I mean, that's really Michael. I mean, he's like that all the time. He doesn't really change from that.
Right.
Charles, as you met too, is Charles. They don't really have another gear from that. So
he scared the living daylights out of me when I was about 8 or 9.
so what happened? I don't remember.
What didn't happen? He just talked, he talks so much trash and he tries to intimidate you and just like he's a great guy, but I was just so scared of him because he was 6'5", 6'6", and hey, little man, what you doing over here? It's just like, oh, I think we were at Pebble Beach for the golf thing. I remember that, but
okay.
yeah, just
I
little
actually
stuff like
forgot
that.
that, but we did. Were you 8 or 10?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Charles is the thing about Charles. I have to give him credit for. He's like that with everybody. I mean,
yeah.
He's like that with Mike Tyson. I mean, he's like that with Charles Barkley. He really doesn't change. And to be honest, I told him I'm over it. I just went to the Super Bowl with him. And I told him, Charles, I'm over this. At some point, you have to grow up. He didn't talk to me for a couple of weeks. But I think he gets the message, it's like, it's a lot.
Right.
It's a lot, but I'm glad I actually forgot about that. That was I think Ronnie Lott was there too.
Yeah, they all were. So good deal. Well, thank you, man. This is awesome, awesome time. And I know a lot of people are
Your grandma would really like this. Your grandma would be very happy about that.
I know.
You should try to get Laura on the show.
I'm going to. She's a heavy hitter.
It's gonna be a hard one though.
She's a heavy hitter.
No, not bad. I think Laura is very shy. She won't admit it, but she usually won't even say that she went to Harvard. She just tells people she went to school in Boston.
I would say
it's
more.
Really hard
she's
to get her
calculated.
to talk about herself.
She's calculated. I'll say that.
Well, you might know better than me.
Yeah.
I don't know that. It'd be good if she'd be a good person. I know she was very impressed with the interview that you did with Danielle. So you can say, hey, you're just as much family. I know she's also very impressed with Danielle and her career. So.
For sure.
She could talk to you about all that Beyonce stuff and all that if she'll admit to it. But,
yeah, I don't know if she'd put that on there. I don't know. Hopefully.
Well,
probably anyway.
Probably not.
Well, thank you, Huck. I appreciate you.
No, I appreciate you too, and congratulations, Chris, on all the good work you're doing. I know I'm hard on you sometimes too. Don't take it personal. It's just the nature of the game for me. I'm really proud of what you've accomplished with your great coaching job, with your podcast, and everything you're doing, and your beautiful kids and your beautiful family. So I wish you all the best, and tell Maddie and the kids I said hi.
I will. Thank you.
All right, you take care.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond the Buckets podcast. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and share the show with your friends. And until next time, take care.